All right, good morning, everybody. Today, chapter 10, externalities. So this is a really interesting topic. Like it says, externalities. We're going to talk about things that happen outside or external to the market, right? So far in the market, we've been talking about the buyers and the sellers and the products that they trade. And we've looked at consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus, which is our measure of how good is the welfare. What is the improvement in the welfare for the people who participated in the marketplace, right? We've asked, are the buyers better off? That we measure by, if I want to answer the question, are the buyers better off? What do I use to answer that question? Consumer surplus. If I want to say, are the sellers better off? What do I use to answer that question? Producer surplus, right? If I want to say, is everybody better off? Total surplus, right? But we've been neglecting the fact that there are other people in the world besides the people who are buying and selling, right? So today we're going to look at them and ask, are they better off or are they worse off? Does that make sense? Because they're an important part of the marketplace as well. Okay, and that's why we call these externalities. And so look at the answers to these questions. What is the externality, right? It's when somebody outside the marketplace gets affected. Why do externalities make market outcomes inefficient? So this is another exciting for another reason, because remember how so far I've said, hey, as long as the market is working okay, we probably shouldn't get involved. We shouldn't put in any government interference. And what are the three basic ways the government can interfere with a marketplace? Who remembers? Price ceilings, price floors, taxes, right? And in all three of those situations, they either did nothing or harmed the market, right? And so the general idea is when the market is working all by itself, you just don't want to touch it, right? You can't maximize total surplus other than having the market work all by itself, okay? But there are some times when the market is broken where we have to step in and help it out, right? And this is the first time that we're going to look at a broken market. So anytime there's an externality, which means somebody outside the market is affected, the market is broken. In other words, now there's a reason to step in and have some governmental effect. Does that make sense? Okay? Because hopefully all through the previous chapters, I've been saying, just let the market work, let the market work. You guys hopefully have been thinking, wait a second, what about this market, and these people are poor and they can't access some basic human right or something like that. Hopefully you guys have been thinking about stuff like that, right? And we're going to start talking a little bit about places where it's broken. Okay, so externalities make market outcomes inefficient. In other words, it's not as maximum total surplus possible, right? You guys remember the definition of efficiency? Maximum total surplus possible, okay? All right, and so how do I fix it? What public policies can fix this externality? Public policy is another way to say government laws or government policies. Okay? And finally, sometimes maybe the problem of externalities can be solved all by, without government intervention, right? So I was just talking about how there was a case for government intervention. Sometimes we're going to look at maybe kind of like a theoretical idea of why it maybe gets fixed on its own, but why I personally don't think externalities will get fixed on their own and that there is actually a scope for government intervention. Okay? And then we'll be done. Okay, so remember a little review, the 10 big principles or the 10 big ideas from chapter 1. Markets are usually a good way to organize economic activity. That's what I was saying earlier. When the market is working all by itself, it's got the maximum amount of total surplus it can, right? We have a good price, we have a good quantity, we have the right people making it, and we have the right people buying it, we should leave it alone. If I do anything to that marketplace, like a tax, price floor, price ceiling, I'm going to mess up the total surplus and make it go down, right? So that's what that's saying. Now, in the absence of market failures, so please remember this word. This is the way economists say broken markets, right? We call it a market failure, all right? So if there is no market failures, well, yeah, the competitive market is efficient. That means it maximizes total surplus, right? So if the market is not broken, that's another way of saying in the absence of market failures, we just want to let the competitive market go, right? However, if there is any sort of market failures, if it breaks at all, and one thing that breaks the market is something called an externality, and it's this. Here's the definition. The uncompensated impact of one person's actions on the well-being of a bystander. Okay? So if somehow this marketplace is making somebody else that's outside, some third party, if it's making them either happy or sad for some reason, that's an externality. And we're going to consider the market as broken. So this is going to hopefully add a little more realism to our models so far. You know, we've been assuming all these like perfect marketplaces where there's many buyers and many sellers, and every buyer who values the good above the price buys it, and every seller who can produce the good for less than the market price will sell it, and everything like that. We're going to hopefully say, hey, what happens if somebody outside the marketplace who's not a buyer or not a seller gets some sort of surplus, either negative or positive, right? We're going to ask that. And so, like I just said, externalities can be negative or positive depending upon whether the bystander, the third party, the guy who's not in the marketplace but is somehow affected by the purchase or sale of a good from the market. This third guy over here is affected. He might be hurt or he might be helped by the outcome of the marketplace. That's called an externality, and it's not incorporated into our model yet. So we're going to have to put it in there. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. So there you go. There we go. Here's the key, right? Buyers and sellers are self-interested, right? So when they're in the marketplace, they're arguing with each other, and they get to a price and a quantity that what? That's perfect for them, the buyers and the sellers, because they're the only people in the marketplace, right? The fact of the matter is, if it affects other people, do the buyers or the sellers on their own care about these other people? No, right? So by definition, if it affects third parties or bystanders, people external to the market, it's not going to be efficient because we haven't taken into account the happiness or the sadness of this third party on the side here. Okay? And so here's the next principle, which is also very important. Governments can sometimes improve market outcomes. Right? When can they improve market outcomes? When they're broken to begin with. Okay? If the market is running well on its own and has, it's efficient, it has maximum amount of total surplus, the government should not get involved. Well, if the government does get involved, it will make the outcome not as good, right? But if the marketplace is broken, such as when there is an externality, the government can improve it. Okay? And so if there's an externality, public policy, again, that's another way of saying government policy, or things the government does, can improve efficiency. Improving efficiency means making more surplus, right? Total surplus, consumer surplus and producer surplus. Once again, just a reminder, when I use surplus in this kind of an idea, we're not talking about like too many products. That's a different kind of surplus, right? When people make too many and they're not sold, and there's extra items sitting on the shelves, that's one kind of surplus. This kind of surplus, remember I'm talking about, is on the consumer side, the happiness left over in their heart after they purchase a product, and on the producer side, it's the difference between the sale price and their costs, right? So kind of like a basic idea of profit. Okay. So let me give you an example of negative externalities, right? So I've been talking about, since this class started, about if there's a guy, a third party, an external actor to the market who's affected positively or negatively by the marketplace, and you're like, what on earth is he talking about? Here's some examples of someone who is external to the marketplace that's being affected negatively by something inside the marketplace, okay? Air pollution from a factory, right? Let's think about that. We've got sellers, factories, and we've got buyers. Let's say this is an automobile factory, right? We got sellers selling cars. We got buyers buying cars. They're self-interested. They argue. They arrive at a price and a quantity that's good for both of them. But what's the fact of the matter is, people who live near the factory are getting air pollution, right? And maybe their health deteriorates. and so maybe they are being harmed negatively, right? So we don't have a maximum amount of total surplus here because, yeah, if we only look at the buyers and the sellers, our total surplus has been maximized, but we have all this negative happiness, right, this sadness going on, this negative surplus from the people whose health is bad because of the air pollution, right? What we'd really like to do is make the buyers and the sellers, when they're arguing about how many cars to make and what price to sell them, to think about the detrimental effects on these third parties, right? If they somehow would care about them, which they won't all by themselves, which is why it's inefficient all by itself, if we could make them care about these third parties, then we could get back to an efficient allocation of goods. Okay? Here's the neighbor's barking dog, right? The neighbor buys, he's the buyer, he buys a dog. The quantity of dogs that he purchases, maybe 0 or 1, right? The difference between 0 or 1, having a dog or not, is just going to be to make him happy or her happy. They are not going to take into account the neighbors. And if you asked all the neighbors, the best number of dogs to be had in the neighborhood might be 0, right? But if you ask the guy, he might think that the most efficient allocation of dogs in the neighborhood is quantity equals 1 or quantity equals 2, right? Does that make sense? So they're not taking into account the others around. Late night stereo blasting from the dorm room next to yours, right? That negatively affects you, even though you're not in that marketplace. Noise pollution from a construction project negatively affects people, even though they're not in the marketplace. Health risk to others from secondhand smoke, right? So each individual who's a smoker makes some decision in their brain on how many cigarettes to smoke for the day based upon their personal happiness, right? They're going to maximize their efficiency, just thinking about themselves and the seller and the amount of cigarettes they can buy. However, if they were to think about how many cigarettes they should smoke for the day and incorporate all of the health benefits of the secondhand smoke, the people around them, I'll bet you they'd pick to choose fewer cigarettes to smoke, right? But on their own, people aren't going to think about the people on the external, on the periphery, right? So also talking on the cell phone while driving, right? It makes the road less safe for other people who don't have anything to do with your decision to talk on the phone or not, right? So they're external to the marketplace, but they can be detrimentally affected. Okay, so let's do a review of welfare economics. What does this mean, welfare economics? What are we asking when we study welfare economics? Who remembers? The well-being of people in the marketplace, right? This is not the kind of welfare that's cash transfers from governments to low-income people. It's how people are faring, if they're faring well or not. Okay, so think about the market for gasoline. That means this is the price for gasoline, and this is the quantity of gasoline. Okay? Traditionally, there's the demand curve, right? And what does the demand curve normally, don't look at here yet. What does the demand curve normally tell us? Right. The WTP, or willingness to pay, for people of gasoline. Okay? However, I guess I wasn't completely honest with you when I taught you what the demand curve meant. Well, I just left out something. Okay? There is the WTP. This is the benefit to all the people who purchase gasoline, right? If I'm willing to pay $4 for a gallon of gasoline, that means that the benefit to me of a gallon of gasoline is up to $4, right? If I get to pay less, yay, I have happiness left over in my heart, right? But there might be benefits or negativities that occur to other people that are not the buyers. Does that make sense? So the demand curve only shows the benefits to the buyers, right? And it leaves out everybody else. Okay? So that's why we'll call it the private value. Now, why do we call it private? It's because it's just the people inside the marketplace, i.e. the buyers, okay? The demand curve just shows the value or the benefits of just the people inside the marketplace. And it ignores everybody outside the marketplace. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's why we call it the private value, because it's private, just the people in the marketplace. Got it? Now, the supply curve, same problem, right? The supply curve, what does it normally measure? Don't look here yet. What does it normally measure, the supply curve? at any price, right? So basically, if I were to look here, I would say, hey, the 10th gallon costs $1 to produce, so they're not willing to sell it for anything less than $1. You have to give them at least $1 before they'll sell the 10th gallon, right? So this is a listing of the costs, which it costs the suppliers to make the product, right? However, it systematically ignores the costs to the rest of the population. Remember that air pollution example, right? The real cost of making a car, sure, is, you know, some metal and some plastic and some labor hours, right? But that's just the cost that the factory is thinking about. The real cost of making the car is all of that plus the smoke that all these people are breathing in and their health negativities. Does that make sense? Okay? That's why we call this supply curve the private cost, because it just is the cost for the people in the marketplace. It forgets all of the people on the outside, on the externalities. Okay? And so in the market equilibrium, right, we're going to sell how many gallons of gasoline? 250, or 25 gallons for 250. Okay? If it turns out that this is the only, the private costs are the only costs that there are, meaning there's no externalities, and that the private benefit is the only benefits that there are to having this good, meaning there's no externalities, well, then this is perfect, right? In the absence of externalities, meaning nobody else is affected outside the marketplace, this is perfect. However, what do you guys think? Do you think there might be externalities in the market for gasoline? I think so. Why do you guys think so? How could other people be affected by how much gasoline I purchase? It's kind of a weird question, but I think it could happen. How could other people be affected by how much gasoline I purchase? Pollution from my car, right? I'm thinking, what's the cost to me? Well, the market price is $2.50, and the suppliers are thinking, here's the list of costs, or how much it costs to make the gasoline. But we're all ignoring what? The negative health attributes that are accruing to these third parties, right? Or maybe because I have more gas, it means I'm driving more. That means that I'm causing more traffic for other individuals. That's a cost that we're not thinking about, right? Maybe I'm wearing down the roadway more. That's a cost that we're not thinking about, right? So what this means is that this supply curve is not capturing all of the real costs from the market for gasoline. Okay? It's only capturing the private costs. Okay? So, how do I add in those negativities, those negative externalities, which is basically extra costs that we're forgetting about? How do I add it in? Well, all I do is I somehow, get a smart guy, calculate what is the external cost to all these other people, right? What is all the cost that the pollution is attacking them? Or the cost of the extra traffic? Or the cost to the government because the roadways getting tore up, right? All of these negative externalities, I calculate them as an external cost, and then guess what do I do? Oh, and so let's suppose that those all equal out to $1 per gallon of gas. Okay? Every gallon of gas I buy, even though at the store I was paying $2.50 for it, there's an additional cost which we're ignoring, unfortunately, of $1 per gallon because of cost, because of smog and all that kind of stuff. Okay? And so how do I fix my diagram to include that cost? Well, I just create this thing called the social cost, which means the everybody cost, the cost to all of society, right? Which is the private cost, which is how much it actually costs to make the stuff, plus the external cost, all of the negative, bad stuff that's happening to the third parties, and I just shift up the supply curve by the value of the external cost. So the external cost is $1, so at every point along the supply curve, I go ahead and raise it by $1. And I have a new cost curve. We'll call it the social cost curve. Does that make sense to everybody? I did? So simply, I fixed the marketplace, really, right? I I said, hey, this is how much it's costing to make the gasoline, right? We know that because that's what the firms are actually paying to produce the gasoline. But it's costing society more than that, actually, to produce gasoline. Because sure, it costs however much it costs to produce gasoline, but plus some bad stuff from when we use the gasoline. Okay, so I've shifted up, and this is the social cost because it's the total cost for all of society. Very easy, you just add up the private and the external costs. Okay, so let's put the demand curve back on there. And now what do you know? As economists, you should always look at where two lines cross and be like, "Whee, yay, two lines are crossing. It's some important point," right? So this is telling me, so this is on my new social cost, my social cost curve with the original demand, okay, the same demand, that the socially optimal point, or like the best point for all of society, should be how many gallons of gasoline? 20. But the private marketplace all by itself, when it ignores everybody else, how many gallons of gasoline are produced? 25. Why do you think that the socially optimal number of gallons of gasoline is lower than what the market wants to provide all by itself? Why do you think it's lower? What do you think? Well, there's bad stuff that happens from the purchase and sale of gasoline, namely smog, traffic, right? Deteriorating the roadway. Because of those negatives, we actually don't want quite as much gasoline sold, because then there'll be too much negativity, too many negative externalities going out to society, right? We want fewer gallons of gasoline sold. And, and so once again, we'll look and we'll ask the question, is this an efficient allocation? Well, what if I restricted gasoline just to 10 gallons? And if someone made the argument, well, hey, gasoline has negative externalities. There's smog and stuff like that. Let's restrict it way down to 10, right? Well, let's look. This is the benefit from selling 10 gallons of gasoline. And this is the social cost. This is every single possible cost we can imagine, right? The benefit still exceeds the cost for all of this area. So we definitely should sell more gasoline. We shouldn't restrict it all the way down to 10, okay? And then at 25, which is what? The place that the regular marketplace wants to sell it, right? The benefit to society is given by the demand curve. So the benefit to society here is 250. But what's the actual total cost to society at this point? 350, right? So should we provide 25 gallons of gasoline? No, because the cost to society is 350. The benefit to society is only 250. We clearly don't want to do this if the costs are outweighing the benefits, okay? So that means that the market equilibrium of 25 is greater than the social optimum. The social optimum of 20 now is where surplus is maximized, okay? So this is the first time that you've ever seen where this number is not efficient, right? Thus far, we've always talked about how this point is efficient, meaning it maximizes consumer and producer surplus. But now suddenly, this is the wrong point. This is the new point that maximizes consumer and producer surplus at 20 gallons and at $3.50 or $3. Okay? And it's because they were forgetting about other people that they are negatively affected. Okay? And so how do I get this to move back, right? Well, simple solution is to do a tax. Whoa, this should be blowing your minds, because everything you've learned about taxes so far is that they're bad and they mess up the society, right? And now I'm telling you, if you tax sellers $1 per gallon, it will fix the problem. How is that possible? What would a tax do? Right? Isn't that how we analyze taxes? If you tax the seller, it's as if the supply curve is shifting up $1, right? Because now, all of a sudden, the sellers are thinking about that $1 per gallon cost that is being imposed on society, right? Before, the problem was nobody was thinking about these poor people over here who are breathing smog and they're getting negative effects at about $1 per gallon. We're going to put that in a quote, right? The negative feeling from breathing the smog is about $1 per gallon of it, right? Well, these people here who are making the decision on how much gas to purchase and sell, we're not thinking about these poor people. So the government said, okay, I have a good solution. I will tax you $1 per gallon, and then all of a sudden, what are the people thinking about? Well, they're now thinking about $1 per gallon tax. So they make their allocations accordingly. They're not necessarily thinking, oh, these poor people over here, we're hurting them around $1 per gallon, right? They're like, oh my goodness, the government's going to charge us $1 per gallon tax. But that's okay. They're still thinking that there is an extra dollar cost. Does that make sense? So they're going to make the right decision. So if I tax the sellers $1, hey, by the way, would it matter if I taxed the buyers $1? No, right? It doesn't matter whether I tax buyers or sellers. It's just easier to imagine why we would want to tax the sellers, because it goes up $1, right? The buyers would come down $1, and we'd still be at the same point, right? So we still get the right spot. We still get the right quantity if no matter who I tax. But you just got to tax them $1, right? For however much, or however much these people out here are harmed, you just have to tax the marketplace that much, okay? So we call that internalizing the externality, right? Because before, nobody was caring that people were hurt $1 per gallon. But the government's like, oh, you're gonna care now because I'm gonna tax you $1, right? So the government's like forcing them to care about these people, but they don't really know why they're caring about them, these people. They're just caring about a tax, right? But it doesn't matter because they're now thinking about the right thing. The government says, you're gonna care now because I'm gonna tax you. We call that internalizing the externality. And so the technical definition is altering incentives so that people take account of the external effects of their actions. Right? So with an externality, the marketplace is broken. Why is it broken? Because people aren't caring that these people over here are being, the people in the marketplace aren't caring that the people outside the marketplace are being harmed. So the government says, oh, you're going to care now because I'm going to tax you the same amount that you're harming everybody else. Boom, solution fixed, right? Our marketplace is no longer broken. The government, with a tax, just fixed something. Pretty crazy, right? Which is the completely opposite from what I taught you during the taxes chapter, that taxes pretty much always break the marketplace. Does that make sense? Okay. So in our example, the $1 per gallon tax on sellers makes sellers' costs equal to the social costs. You know, you're going to care about everybody's costs because I'm just going to make your costs be that way. Okay? So here's the general idea. When we make the people on the inside of the marketplace pay all of the costs, including the outside the marketplace costs, it fixes. The market equilibrium is now the social optimum. It goes to the right spot. So, like I said before, does it matter whether we put the tax on the buyers or the sellers? No. The same thing always happens, right? Whether I tax buyers or sellers. So I could have put it on the buyers. It doesn't matter who you tax. You just have to make the people in the marketplace feel the hurt and the pain of the people outside the marketplace when they're suffering from the actions of these people. That makes sense? It's kind of a simple, intuitive idea, right? Okay. So that was negative externalities, right? When people are harmed. Now we're going to look at positive externalities. What do you think a positive externality would be? Like, first of all, maybe a definition or an example or anything. What do you think? Right. Doing something good inside the marketplace that helps other people, right? So we did something good for the government, or the environment, sorry. If I do something good for the environment, it benefits other people, right? Okay. So here's another example. Being vaccinated against contagious diseases, right? It protects you. If I get a vaccine, it protects me, and that's good. There's a benefit to me from being protected, but there is a benefit to everybody else that I come into contact with that I'm not thinking about, right? Let's be honest. When people get vaccinated, they get vaccinated so they don't get sick. They don't think about the fact that it's going to be good for everybody else in the room too, because they're not going to get sick now from you. Does that make sense? So you're forgetting about this benefit. And it sucks because it's not good, because if we forget about the benefit, then we're going to purchase too little of the quantity of the good in the marketplace, right? Maybe we'll get vaccinated against too few diseases or something like that. Okay. Here's another one. R&D. Anybody know what R&D is? Research and development. Very good. So research and development is good for a company. Why? Because they invent new things and then the company can invent cool new products, right? But it's good for all of society because, you know, this technology kind of spreads and it helps other people out, and other people in other industries can use that new technology and make their industries more efficient as well. Okay? So people who do research and development inside companies, they don't do it for the good of society. They don't, right? They do it for the good of their own company, but it does have spillover positive effects to other people. All right? Going to college. Here's another one, right? Going to college is good because it helps you, which is the reason you go to college, but it also helps other people because you're a more informed, maybe more tolerant person. You know, having a more informed populace is definitely better for all of society. Okay? So the fact of the matter is that the individuals are going to college only because of the benefit they get themselves, but there is a benefit to other people that's being lost. It's being forgotten about in the marketplace, right? So this is another example of where the marketplace is actually broken. Okay? In kind of a good way, right? But it's still broken. Okay, so what do? Well, we have to realize something. Remember the demand curve is the willingness to pay, or it's like the benefit to the consumer, right? Well, we have to realize that with a positive externality, the social value, meaning the benefit to all of society of the good, let's say of a college education, includes the private value. So you're like, okay, the value of the college education to me is blank dollars. That's the private value, the direct value that I get. This is also known as the WTP, right? Or the demand curve. But there's also this external benefit. It's the extra benefit to all of other people when I get a college degree, or the extra benefit to all other people when I get a vaccine, or when I do research and development, because then I can share some new inventions with them, right? So the socially optimal queue is going to maximize welfare, because at any lower value, if I were to go lower than the socially optimal queue, the social value of additional units exceeds their cost, so I should go ahead and make them. And in a higher queue, the cost of the unit is more than its social value, so I should not make it. Okay, so let's do this flu shot example, right? This demand curve is the WTP of the buyers of flu shots, right? Which another way is to say, this demand curve is the benefit to all the people of having a flu shot, right? So guy number 10, the benefit to him of having a flu shot is $30 to him, his marginal benefit, right? His marginal value. Guy number 15, the value to him of having a flu shot is $25, right? This is just the private value. This is the cost of a shot. But this doesn't tell the whole story, right? There's additional goodness to society that comes from a flu shot. Of how much? I'm going to imagine it's $10 a shot. Okay? I'm going to imagine the happiness in society that goes to other people, not me, when I get a flu shot is $10 of happiness. Right? I do this kind of a lot in this class, right? We try to capture happiness in dollar value terms. Okay. This doesn't, it ignores that $10. Therefore, this marketplace all by itself is broken, right? When I look at guy number 10 and there is a $30 benefit to him, right? He gets $30 of happiness from guy number 10 from buying the flu shot. Society actually gets how much happiness? Another $10, right? So the total happiness to all of society is, from flu shot number 10, is the $30 that go to the private individual who's in the marketplace, plus another $10 to all the rest of society. So the total benefit to all of society is actually $40 for the 10th flu shot. Does that make sense? Okay? And that happens for every flu shot that's given. Okay? So what you'll have to do is draw the social value curve. All right? Think about all the people who are all the people in society who value it, and redraw the value curve. Okay? Find the socially optimal quantity, and then think about how we could fix the marketplace or internalize the externality. Okay? So I'll give you guys about 5 minutes, or a little less. Okay. So let's check this out. Remember, the demand curve is the private value, meaning it's the benefit of the flu shot to the people inside the marketplace. That's why we call it private, because it's just the value of the people inside the marketplace. But the social value is actually what we totally care about. There's a $10 external benefit. The other people get, every time someone gets a flu shot, everybody else in society gets $10 happier, because then they get less sick, right? So that means the external benefit goes up $10 at every point, right? And so the social value is this new, it's kind of like a new demand curve, right? It's not technically the demand curve, because this is the real demand curve for the consumers, right? For the people who are buying. The WTP is strictly still here. But if you were to ask society, all of society, how much they want, right? How much they would be willing to pay, it would be like this new curve. Does that make sense? Like if you could somehow ask all of society what they'd be willing to pay, then it would be this curve. You really can't, but like that's the way to imagine what this social value curve is, okay? This is the private benefit. Okay, and so now we look and we say, hey, there's 2 new lines crossing. We should be happy. What is this new line called? It's called the socially optimal point, right? This is how many flu shots we actually want to have in society. We actually want to have 25 flu shots in society, right? Because it's the place where the lines cross for the social costs, or the social benefits. But the marketplace is only providing how many? 20, right? Oops. So how can we encourage the marketplace to produce 25? Yeah, so there's an external benefit. Remember what the government did when there was an external cost. What did they do? They said, okay, it's hurting everybody $1. I'm going to tax you $1 to make you care, right? Well, what can the government do if it's helping everybody by $10? Right. They can give them $10 per shot to the people in the marketplace so they do care. Does that make sense? Either way, what you have to do is you have to make the people inside the marketplace care about the stuff that's happening to the outside, right? And so basically it's just an opposite tax, right? When the government takes money from you, it's called a tax. When the government gives money to you, it's called a subsidy, right? So what they would do is they would subsidize $10 per shot. And that would push the demand curve for the buyers up, right? And now all of a sudden the buyers do care about everyone else, not because they care about everyone else, but they care about being able to get $10 from the government if they get a vaccine, right? So if the government paid you $10 to get a flu shot, I guarantee you more people will get a flu shot, right? That's the thing. That's what's going on here. It's just pushing it from 20 to 25. Okay? That's kind of an interesting thing. Test of intuition. Would it technically matter if I gave the subsidy to the buyers or the sellers? No, it wouldn't, right? Because a subsidy is just an opposite tax, right? It's just the reverse of a tax. So if it doesn't matter whether I tax buyers or sellers, it also doesn't matter whether I give the subsidy to buyers or sellers, right? If I gave it to buyers, it would be as if their demand curve was moving up to this green one. But if I if I gave the money to suppliers, now all of a sudden the suppliers are going to want to produce more, and it would move the supply curve down to here, and we'd still be at the right spot. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, let's do a summary of externalities here. So, if there's a negative externality, which means it hurts people, okay, we know that people are buying too much of the good. Q is too high, according to the social outcome, right? So how do I fix it? Oh, never mind. Let's go to positive first, and then we'll go to how to fix it. If it's a positive externality, right, that means that there's too much good stuff happening, and so people are not buying enough of it. right? Because they're forgetting about everyone else. So we want to somehow force them to buy more of it because it's good for people. Okay? And so to fix the problem, you have to make the people inside care about the outside people. How do you do that? It's called internalizing the externality. You either tax them if it's harming people, right? Or if it's helping people, you give them money. You subsidize them. Kind of a simple answer. But it makes sense, right? You're fixing this problem that they're ignoring these third parties. So this is cool because it's the first time where we've seen where the government actually doing something in the marketplace is actually making it better off. Right? Every other time the tax made it worse off because the marketplace wasn't broken. If the marketplace is still working and there's no market failure, we should not have the government get involved. Well, if the government gets involved, it will lower the outcome. If the market is broken, meaning there's a market failure, we should go ahead and have the government get involved and make them internalize the externality. All right, we'll continue thinking about externalities, and we'll think about what public policies could happen. Remember the basic idea that we learned last slide was, right, if it's good, it's a positive externality, we want the government to pay the people in the marketplace for it. If it's a negative externality, we want them to tax them because we want them to make them feel the cost. Okay? So there's two basic approaches. Okay? Well, the first idea is called this command and control policy, and that regulates behavior directly. And the idea here is instead of doing the taxing or the subsidizing idea, it just looks directly at the supply and demand curve and says, whoa, socially optimal quantity is 20. It's just illegal to make more than 20 in this market. That's why it's called the command and control, because it just takes the quantity and just moves it down and just makes it illegal to make any more than that. Okay? And so some examples we have are the limits on the quantity of pollution. Right? If you might see or you might know that there's a law like, oh, there's only allowed to have so many tons of carbon monoxide coming out of your smokestack or something like that. Right? Requirement that firms adopt a particular technology to reduce emissions. Okay, same sort of thing. Then there's the market-based policies, which are changing the incentives, which is what I showed you earlier, the taxes and the subsidies, right? You make the people in the marketplace just care about everybody else by like imposing on a tax or a subsidy to them, and then all of a sudden you just let them make their decision on their own. Okay? So an example would be corrective taxes and subsidies, like we talked about. Okay? There's this other thing that's been more popular lately in the pollution realm, and it's called tradable pollution permits. I will give you guys a little bit more example of what those are later in this class. But just for now, what I need you to keep in mind is just there's two real ways to change the quantity back to the socially optimal quantity. You can either, as the government, just directly regulate it, or you can kind of change the costs and the benefits for the people in the marketplace and then let them do the right thing on their own. Okay, so let's talk about this corrective taxes and subsidies. This is a market-based approach, right? So what we do is we change the incentives. And so if I'm taxing something not to get revenue, but if I'm taxing something to fix the broken marketplace, we call that a corrective tax. Now, yes, the nice thing about corrective taxes is not only do they help society, they also provide money for the government to run, right? It's like double nice, this corrective tax. Okay? And basically the idea is it's designed to induce private decision makers, so the people in the marketplace, the buyers and sellers, we want them to care about the costs that they're imposing on other people, right? So we just tax them however much they're hurting other people. Okay? The guy who came up with it, Arthur Pigou, and so we sometimes call them Pigovian taxes. Kind of a weird word, right? But they were thought up by him. He was an economist. He came up with this good idea. Hey, taxes can actually help in the presence of negative externalities, right? And so the key here is, how much do we tax people? We have to tax them exactly equal to the cost that other people are feeling. Does that make sense? We have to tax them however much it's hurting everybody else. And then on the flip side, for positive externalities, how much do we give people? How much do we give the market participants? Exactly equal to whatever the benefit is to everybody else. Okay? And that's the way to make this work properly. Okay. Normally, taxes and subsidies do what? If the marketplace is working perfectly, what do subsidies and taxes do? They mess up the marketplace, right? Normally, and they move it away from the social optimum. However, in the case of corrective taxes and subsidies, because the market is already broken to begin with, okay, what they do is they fix the market by aligning private incentives, meaning the people inside the marketplace, they care about society's interests. Not directly, but they care about the tax, and the tax represents the cost to society, okay? And so basically it's very nice. It makes the people inside the marketplace, the private decision makers, take into account the external costs and benefits of their actions. So they go ahead and make the right decision from society's point of view. Okay. And then, of course, this is very positive because it moves society towards that socially optimal point where the total surplus is maximized. Okay, so let's compare these corrective taxes, which are the market-based solution, to regulations, where regulations are not market-based, right? They're like, you just cannot produce more than X quantity of goods. Or think about it in the flu shot example that we had a couple minutes ago. The government would say, up to 25 people have to get a flu shot. We're just forcing 25 people to get a flu shot. That would be a regulation, right? Whereas the corrective taxes would be, well, corrective subsidy here, we would give everybody $10 if they got a flu shot, right? They both get to the right quantity. One of them seems a little maybe like less heavy-handed, you know what I mean? So let's imagine that different firms have different costs of pollution abatement. That is, this is fancy speak for getting rid of their pollution, okay? So if I look out here, I see these power plants. Let's say there's two power plants next to each other, right? And they're both polluting. But let's imagine, and this is probably true, it might be easier for one plant to lower its pollution. It might be harder for the other plant to lower its pollution. Does that make sense? Let's just imagine this example, okay? And so what do I want? If I need to lower pollution in this place, what's the cheapest way to do it? Make the firm that's easy to lower pollution, make them lower their pollution. The other firm, if I make them lower their pollution, it's going to cost a lot. And it will be more expensive to do that route. All right. What I want is the firm with the lower cost of abatement, the firm for whom it's easier to lower its costs. They lower its pollution. They should go ahead and lower the pollution. Okay. And so the pollution tax is efficient because it does this, right? Firms that can, if I tax the polluters, right? Firms that it's easy to lower the amount of pollution they do, they're just going to do it to try to avoid the taxes, right? But the other firm for which it's very difficult and very expensive to lower its amount of pollution, they're just going to be like, we're just going to pay the tax. We'll just take the hit, right? And so if you tax people who pollute, this is the same thing as that internalizing the externality, right? We just putting a tax on the marketplace. And then we have efficient allocation, because really what we have is these firms becoming that the firm for whom it's the cheapest to lower its pollution, they go ahead and lower their pollution. And then these people, they have an incentive to, I don't know, to get with the program here and fix their factory so it's cheaper to lower the costs of pollution here. Does that make sense? Okay. And so the other option, which some people think is more fair, is just say both firms must cut their pollution by half, right? That would be a command and control policy. Does everybody see the difference between the two? All right? Two power plants, they're both polluting. We need to cut pollution. Either I could just tax the people who pollute, and some people are going to keep polluting and pay the tax. Other people are going to lower their pollution, so they don't have to pay the tax. Cool. we have lower pollution. The other option is to make a law that says both of the firms have to lower their pollution by half. Okay, that's the other option. And so that's command and control. And so corrective taxes end up being better for the environment, actually. Pause for a moment, though, and let me ask you, why would people have problems sometimes with the taxes? Why do you think some people would want the regulations? Well, pollution has negative externalities that we're trying to get rid of, but both the taxes and the regulations can get rid of pollution. They both can, right? I think that most people, if you were to say, oh, let's go ahead and just tax the polluters, then I think what people think of is, well, that's not fair. You can't just pollute the environment and just like pay the tax. Like the richer companies are just going to be able to pay the tax, and they're just going to pollute the environment more. You can't pay to pollute. Basically, they kind of think of it backwards, right? They're like, you can't pay your way to pollute in the air, right? Let's make force everybody to lower their regulation, lower their pollution equally, right? But corrective taxes are actually better for the environment, and let's see how. So think about this. If I tax you for polluting, guess what? Every year, your company's going to engage in research to try to come up with ways to be a smaller polluter. Does that make sense? If, on the other hand, all I do is pass a law that says you have to reduce your pollution by half, guess what? Firms reduce their pollution by half, and then they stop reducing pollution. Does that make sense? They don't have the incentive to keep lowering their pollution. Whereas if I just keep taxing them all the time, they have the incentive every year to try to get even less pollution than the year before. Okay? Does that make sense? So if a cleaner technology becomes available, firms are like, oh, I'm going to adopt this new cleaner technology so I don't have to end up paying this tax. Right? But if, on the other hand, I just have a regulation that says that they had to reduce their pollution by half, once they do that, they're not going to do any more work in adopting new cleaner technologies. Okay? That's what I just said, actually. So, right? So firms have no incentive for further reduction once they hit whatever they hit the law limit. Once they get under that, they're like, I'm not going to lower my pollution. Okay. So let's look at an example of a corrective tax. The gas tax. Is gas a good thing to tax? Yes. Why? Right? First, we talked about the fact that gas might be good to tax because it's very inelastic, right? So we're not going to have many market distortion. But the second reason why gas is good to tax is because it's very possible that the gasoline market all by itself is broken because of negative externalities. There are at least 3 negative externalities. I kind of brought these up already. One, when you buy gas, then you drive, right? And you make the roads crowded. So you make traffic. When you make traffic, that makes other people suffer, right? So, I mean, when they make traffic, it makes you suffer too. But the fact of the matter is that there is a negative cost imposed on other people when you drive. Okay, accidents, right? If you drive more, or even if you have a bigger, more gas-guzzling vehicle, then when you do crash, it's going to do more damage, right? And so you impose a tax on other people. And finally, there's pollution. When you drive your car, and the more gas you buy, the more gas you will burn, the more pollution you will make. Okay? So look, there are 3 negative externalities. So we know that the market is broken. That's called a market failure because of the externalities. So we need to fix that. How can I fix something with a negative externality? What are we supposed to do? Do you remember? Tax it. Have the government tax the product. And the amount of the tax has to be equal to what? How much should it be? How much should I tax them? Right. Somehow we got to find out what's the external cost. Now that's kind of difficult, of course, but somehow we have to find the external cost, and then we tax them that amount. Okay. So yeah, so that's the gas tax. Now let's do a problem This is kind of a little bit more difficult, but this is the pollution control cap and trade approach. Okay, let's imagine that there's two power plants, right? And so they burn coal and they make a bunch of smoke coming out of the top. It's really bad. They emit 40 tons of sulfur dioxide. This is a bad thing. It's very bad to breathe this in. And so they emit a total of 80 tons per month of sulfur dioxide, the two plants that are right next to each other. Okay? So the government decides, they do some analysis, and they realize the social quantity, like the socially optimal quantity, is quantity equals 60, not quantity equals 80. Okay, so we have to lower to 60. Okay? So because of the negative externalities, because the SSO2 is poisonous and it's bad for people, we want to have them reduce it. How do I make them reduce it? Well, the first option, before we get to that, and then for the firms, there's two firms, Acme, it only costs them $100 per ton. They're both producing 40 right now, right? If Acme were to go down 1 ton, it would cost them $100 a ton. If US Electric would go down, it would cost them $200 a ton just to go down 1 ton. Does that make sense? So in other words, it's easier for Acme to be a low polluter. It's hard for US Electric. Maybe US Electric has like an older plant and it's less efficient or something. I don't know. Maybe it's really hard to do updates there. Okay? But at Acme, it's easy, right? So, well, first of all, let me ask you a little question here. In order to be cheapest for society, which firm would we actually want to reduce pollution? Yeah, in order to do what's best and cheapest and most efficient for society, we know we need to cut some pollution. But which firm should cut pollution? Or should they both cut it equally? Yeah, Acme should. And this is just building intuition so you understand how to do the rest of the problem. Why should Acme? That's not fair. Why are we going to let US Electric pollute more? Why? Okay, so there's the idea. For US Electric, in order to reduce their pollution, it's $200 per ton, right? So that means every time they go down 1 ton, they incur this cost, right? Acme, it's cheaper, it's easier for them to reduce their pollution. Okay, so first policy, this is what most people would think of as the fair approach, right? Just have some law that comes in and say, we need 60 tons total. We can only allow 60 tons total, which means each firm can only be allowed 30 tons each, right? So they're currently doing 40 tons each. And now you say each firm must cut down to 30, right? So go ahead and find the cost of each firm and the total cost to all of society for this. The regulation, which some people think of as fair option, right? Forcing them both to cut each half, or 25%. All right, what do we got? How much does it cost? How much does it cost Acme to reduce by 10 tons? It costs $1,000, right? Because every ton that Acme goes down, it costs them $100. So in order to go down 10 tons of pollution, that means it's going to cost them $1,000. US Electric, it costs them how much? 2,000, very good. Okay, so Acme is 1,000, US Electric is 2,000. That means total cost to society is how much? 3,000. Okay. Right? And to get down to 60 total tons. But that was not a market-based solution. That was a regulation. We call that command and control. Okay? Some people are in favor of this because they're like, oh, we're just going to force everybody to be equal, right? And go down by 10 tons each. But let's suppose another option, okay? These things are called tradable pollution permits, and they've become very popular lately. Okay? I'm going to teach you how this works. So let's say that they both are doing 40 tons a month of SO2, that's sulfur dioxide, right? We have to get down to 60 tons per month total. Now here's the interesting thing. We're just going to say it doesn't matter who pollutes as long as in total it's not more than 60. Does that make sense? It doesn't matter who pollutes as long as it's not more than 60. So what we'll do is we'll make a pollution permit. We will have these permits, and each permit allows you to pollute 1 ton. And how many total are we going to print? Only 60 of them. And then it doesn't matter who gets the permits, right? There's only going to be 60 tons of pollution permits out there. Does that make sense? So you give 60 permits. Each one allows a person to pollute 1 ton, right? You have to use a permit every time you want to pollute. So you give 30 permits to each firm, right? So it's still fair, right? You have 60 total permits. You give 30 to each firm. Each firm can only produce 30, or each firm can only emit as much pollution as they have pollution permits. And then the important part is after this, you allow them to trade. Anyone can trade. If you want to just be a big old polluter, well, you just buy a whole bunch of permits, right? If it's easier for you not to pollute, you go ahead and sell all your permits. Have a nice little profit, okay? So here's the idea. Each firm may use all of its permits, and it'll emit 30 tons. If it can emit less than 30 tons and it has leftover permits, they should sell them and try to get some money, right? If they need to emit more than 30 tons, they can just purchase extra permits from somebody else who has leftover permits. Okay? The idea here is this is a market-based approach, but we're still guaranteed to not have any more than 60 tons of pollution because there's only 60 permits out there. Does that make sense? Okay. So let's imagine this is a little bit more difficult, but let's imagine that Acme uses 20 permits, right? It means Acme reduces its pollution all the way down to 20, okay? Which means they have 10 leftover permits. They sell the 10 to US Electric for $150 each, okay? Tell me how much the total cost would be to society. So do the cost for Acme, the cost to US Electric, and then add those up and do the total cost for society. Okay? Okay. Acme. How much does it cost Acme to reduce its pollution? Well, let's first think. How many tons is Acme polluting? Do you remember how many I said that they were? At the beginning, they're doing 40, right? But then afterwards, how many permits were they going to use up? Just 20. Which means that they were going to go from 40 all the way down to 20, right? How much would it cost them to go from 40 all the way down to 20? It would cost them $2,000. Where are we? Here it is. Spends $2,000 to reduce emissions by 20 tons, right? But that's not the only cost. So it pays $2,000. However, what does it do? How many leftover permits does it have? 10. And what does it do? It sells them to this other guy for $150 a pop. So how much money does it get from selling the permits? Right, $1,500. So it's spending $2,000 to reduce its emissions down to 20. But even though it's spending $2,000, it's getting $1,500 from the other power plant. So what is its total cost to Acme? It's only $500. Does that make sense? Now, let's do this other guy, US Electric, right? What do? How many tons do they pollute? Do you remember? At the beginning, they were doing 40, right? Then they got 30 permits, but how many permits did they buy? 10 of them. So now how many permits does US Electric have total? 40. So it has 40 permits. It wants to pollute 40 tons, so it doesn't do anything. Does that make sense? Except it has to buy the 10 permits. And how much do the 10 permits cost? Do you remember? $1,500. Right? So it uses 10 of these 10 that they bought, plus the original 30 permits, and it spits out 40 tons of pollution. Okay. It doesn't have to spend anything on reducing its pollution because it's not reducing pollution, it's still being a big old polluter. Okay? And the cost to US Electric is $1,500 just for the permits. That make sense? So what's the total cost to all of society? Well, there's only 2 firms in society, but let's say what's the total cost to all of society for this? $2,000. Okay. What do you notice? If we did the regulation, how much was the total cost? Do you remember? Flip back in your notes and check. It was 3,000 when we did the regulation. And now it's only 2,000. Hey, guess what? We have the same outcome in both situations, right? The whole point was to get down to our society only having 60 tons of pollution every month, right? But one way cost 3,000 when we did the regulation. The other way cost 2,000. Why is this way so much cheaper? What is it? We get the same benefit, reduce pollution, but this one's way cheaper. Okay, the idea is behind the permits, but how does it make it cheaper? Fundamental. The idea is Acme, remember it's easier for Acme to lower pollution, and Acme reduced its pollution by all of the 20, right? And US Electric didn't reduce its pollution at all, okay? So the idea here is we get the same benefit, we get only 60, we reduce from 80 to 60 tons, but it's way cheaper for society, okay? So this is awesome. These are called tradable pollution permits, and they actually exist. We got the same goal, but a lower total cost for reduced pollution. That make sense? I just kind of want you guys to know about how tradable pollution permits works, because it definitely targets this problem of externality. Okay, so here's a little bit more information on this tradable pollution permit system. So it's always does it at a lower cost than regulation, which is really awesome. Okay, and here's the basic idea how it works. Firms with a low cost of reducing pollution, if it's easy for you as a firm to reduce your pollution, you do it, and you have leftover permits and you sell them, right? Firms it's hard to reduce their pollution, they just buy the permits, right? Some people, when they don't understand this system, they don't understand why people can just buy the right to pollute the atmosphere. They don't understand what's going on here, right? But yes, by buying the right from someone else, that means the other person reduce their pollution, okay? So the result of the tradable pollution permits is that the pollution reduction is concentrated among those firms with the lowest costs. Whoops. And so that's why it's always cheaper to use tradable pollution permits to reduce pollution than just make a law that everybody has to reduce the pollution. Does that make sense? Okay, tradable pollution permits in the real world. In the United States, we've had SO2, sulfur dioxide permits traded since 1995. We've had NO2, nitrogen oxide permits traded in the northeastern United States since 1999. And starting January 1st, 2005, they had carbon permits issued. So this is happening in the real world because people notice it leads to better outcomes. So both tradable pollution permits and corrective taxes are both market-based solutions, right? Neither of them is this command and control solution. And so let's compare them, right? Like most demand curves, firms' demand for the ability to pollute is a downward sloping function of the price of polluting, right? So they have downward sloping demand. And a corrective tax raises this price and reduces the amount of pollution. The tradable pollution permit is very similar. It restricts the supply of the pollution rights, and it has the same effect as a tax. So basically, the corrective tax, the Pagovian tax, and the tradable pollution permit, they actually lead you up to the same exact outcome, okay? But here's the thing. Some people like the tradable pollution permit system, well, policymakers exactly, because like, let's say that you tax all of the firms who pollute. We know that will reduce pollution, but we don't exactly know how much it'll reduce it by, right? Whereas on the other hand, the tradable pollution permit system, you can say, okay, I only am issuing 60 permits for this entire society, and we know we'll have no more than 60 tons of pollution coming out, right? So that's why sometimes the tradable pollution permit system helps. Okay. So you'll hear some complaints that look like this. Some people and many environmentalists argue that no one can buy the right to pollute. Some people have the issue with the stankier firm, right, the more polluting firm buying the permits. Like, why do you buy the right to harm the environment? Generally, the government issues a set number for free. And then anything else can be bought or sold, but not from the government, from each other. Yeah. I mean, why is this a bad objection? Well, I want an iPhone and I want a car. I want a lot of goods. I do want a little bit of pollution. I just don't want a lot of pollution, right? Like, I can't have a car to drive or I can't have an iPhone to use unless the factory makes them and there's going to be a little pollution, right? So I do want a little pollution. I just don't want a lot, right? And so the market-based approach actually kind of takes this into account. It says, all right, we want a little bit of pollution, which means we want to reduce a lot of the pollution only just to a little bit amount. And the people who we want to reduce their pollution are the people for whom it's the cheapest to pollute, to reduce the pollution. Okay. All right. Finally, we're going to do our last bit. All right. The last piece of this chapter is going to look at private solution to the externalities problem. Right. So thus far, we've seen, hey, when third parties get injured or benefited from actions of the people in the marketplace, we call those externalities. They're not thought about by the people in the market, and so we have to use the government to kind of internalize these problems. One noted economist said that, hey, perhaps people will fix it on their own without the government getting involved. I'll show you his kind of example, or his idea, and then we'll talk about some problems to it. Okay, so some people might have this kind of private solution. Some externality problems might be solved with a private solution. For example, moral codes and social sanctions, right? If you can imagine littering, for example, right? Littering is definitely a negative externality, right? It makes the land not as beautiful, maybe it pollutes it or something like that, and then everybody else bears a cost, right? But maybe if it's morally not right, or like if somebody sees you litter and they're like, oh, shame on you, right? And they have that's like a social sanction, maybe that will stop littering and the government doesn't even have to get involved. Okay, that's one idea. Charities, right? The Sierra Club, they try to look out for the environment. They're not attached to the government. And then finally, there's this very interesting idea that you could actually make a contract between the harmed third party and the people in the market. If you can write a contract between them and they're like, hey, you're going to harm us, so you better pay us. Well, then now the people in the marketplace, yes, they do care about the externalities, right? Okay. So the Coase theorem, this came from an economist called Roald Coase, his name was, and they said if people, private parties, can costlessly bargain over the allocation of resources, they can solve the externalities problem on their own. Meaning, if I can get these people that are affected outside the marketplace to costlessly negotiate with the people inside the marketplace, right? Then they'll have the social outcome on their own. Okay. Here's an example, okay? Let's say that Dick owns a dog named Spot, right? There's a negative externality, though. What's the negative externality of owning a dog? Barking. Everybody else has a cost, right? Let's imagine, for simplicity of this model, that there's only one neighbor. Okay, her name is Jane, and it disturbs her. What we want is a socially efficient outcome that maximizes Dick's happiness, but also Jane's well-being too, because Jane has a barking dog, right? If we just forget about Jane and we just let Dick do what he wants to do, he's going to have the dog, clearly, right? Because he doesn't take into account this third party, Jane, her costs. Okay, so the totally socially efficient outcome is going to be this. If we know that Dick wants to have Spot more, if his benefit to having Spot is more than Jane's value of peace and quiet, then we should, as a society, we should want Dick to have the dog because he gets more happiness than she gets unhappiness from having the dog, right? But the other hand, if Jane likes peace and quiet more than Dick likes having a dog, well, we don't want there to be a dog in our society, right? And so the Coase theorem says if these people can bargain on their own costlessly, they'll reach the efficient outcome on its own. How is this going to happen? Well, let me show you. Let's give a scenario. Scenario number one. Let's say this. Dick has the right to keep Spot. Let's just say the law says this. Dick has the right. You have a right to have a dog if you want to. Let's say that Dick, the benefit is $500, but the cost of Spot's barking is $800. Okay? Now let's think about this. In the private market all by itself, the one where we ignore Jane, what's going to happen? Well, Dick's clearly going to have a dog, right? He wants to have $500 of happiness in his heart from having a dog, right? That's his consumer surplus from having a dog, $500. And he has the right to have Spot, right? So in the private market, that's going to be what happens. But what's best for society here? Should there be a dog? No, there shouldn't, right? The dog gives $500 of happiness to society, but it takes away $800 of happiness because of the barking, right? So, market failure, right? On its own, the market's going to have a dog. Dick's going to have a dog. But what we really want when we incorporate the cost to the external people, we don't want there to be a dog. So, we know that the socially efficient outcome, Spot says bye-bye, right? Spot is not around. But how are we going to get to that point, right? Because look, if you go up to Dick and say, hey, you can't have a dog, he's going to be like, no, I have the right to have a dog, right? Because we do, actually, in America. You can have a dog in your backyard if you want. Okay? So how are we going to get to this outcome? Right? Well, we're going to let them bargain, okay? Jane will pay Dick $600 to get rid of Spot, right? If we let them bargain with each other, I mean, it might not be $600. It could be any dollar value between $500 and $800, by the way. Jane gets $800 of happiness from not having a dog around, right? So if she only has to pay $600 to get rid of that dog, she's happy. Because she still gets her $800 of happiness, right? So she has like a surplus of $200. Dick, on the other hand, he likes his dog, but only to the tune of $500. If you give him $600, he will value $600 more than his dog, which is worth to him $500. Okay? Spot's out of there. Does that make sense? So we didn't have to get the government involved and have a tax, like have a barking tax or, you know, tradable barking permits or something like that, right? We didn't have to get the government involved. We were able to have the private parties negotiate on their own. Okay, so then suddenly the private outcome becomes the efficient outcome. And that's the idea. And let's change the numbers around. Let's do scenario 2. Let's say that Dick has the right to keep Spot again, but now the benefit to Dick of having Spot is $1,000. The cost to Jane is $800 for barking. Okay? Now, under this new scenario, what's the socially efficient outcome? Should we have a dog or should we not have a dog? We should have a dog in society, right? Because now Dick wants to have Spot to the tune of $1,000, right? So socially efficient outcome, see Spot stay, right? How are we going to get there? Well, this one's easy. Dick has the right to have Spot. He's going to buy Spot. He's going to get a dog and get $1,000 worth of happiness. Jane would be willing to pay up to $800 to this guy to get rid of his dog, but he's not going to accept it, right? So it's just there's going to be a dog and it's going to be barking. But it's best for society because the dog brings $1,000 worth of happiness and only $800 worth of pain. Right? So it's worth it to have a dog in our society. Does that make sense? Finally, oh yeah, and again, private outcome is the efficient outcome in this situation. Finally, in case 3, let's say that instead of Dick having the right to have a dog, we switch the rights around. We switch it to make it Jane has the legal right to peace and quiet. Let's say that. Okay, just to make it interesting. Now, the benefit to Dick of having Spot is $800. The cost to Jane of having Spot is $500. So let me ask you the question. What's the socially efficient outcome? What's best for society? Yeah, exactly. The socially efficient outcome is that we want the dog, right? But who has the rights in this situation? Jane. So who's got to pay who? Dick has to pay Jane. How much is he willing to pay? He's willing to pay $800. He only has to pay how much, though? $500. So he'll pay anywhere between $500 and $800, right? And both people will be better off. Okay? So we want Dick to keep Spot. Let's say that Dick pays Jane $600, some number right in between $500 and $800, right? To be okay with it. Does that make sense? So the direction of who pays who is determined by who's got the rights according to the law, right? But it doesn't really even matter who's got the rights because every time the private outcome is equal to the efficient outcome, right? What ends up happening in the marketplace all by itself gets to the efficient outcome. Okay? So this is an example of what's called the Coase theorem. And it depends on the two parties, the people in the marketplace and the people outside the marketplace, being able to negotiate costlessly, which is maybe a big assumption, right? It depends on this idea. Okay, so here you go. The private market achieves the efficient outcome regardless of who has the rights, right? We get to the efficient outcome, either dog there or dog not there. It doesn't matter actually who's got the rights. That just changes who pays who. But this does depend on the fact that both parties, both the people in the marketplace and the people outside the marketplace who are harmed, can costlessly negotiate. Okay, let's do an example. I'll kind of walk you guys through this. Let's suppose that there are 1,000 people in Green Valley, the town, and they want to swim in Blue Lake, and altogether they value it at $100,000. Okay? So, they want to go swimming. But then there's a factory that pollutes the lake and makes people not able to swim because it dumps some sort of toxins into it, right? Now it could buy some upgrades that wouldn't pollute, and it would cost $50,000, right? So let's just think real quick. What's the socially efficient outcome? What do we want? Do we want the people to be able to swim, or do we want the factory to be able to pollute? We want people to be able to swim. Why? Because it's $100,000 of benefit for them to be able to swim, and it only costs $50,000 to society, right? So clearly it's better off. We want people to swim, right? So let's talk about a Coase-like private solution, and then why this might not work in the real world, okay? Let me ask you something. If we'll get to the right solution whether the residents have the right to swim or whether the factory has the right to pollute, right? Because it doesn't actually matter. Okay, let's talk about a Coase-like private solution. Whoops. Any ideas on what people could do? Right? Is that what you're going to say? The residents pay the factory, right? This makes sense. The residents, they value this at $100,000 of happiness, right? They can easily take $50,000, pay for the factory to have its polluting equipment changed or whatever, right? And then they still get happiness. But why might this not work in the real world? Any ideas? The number one thing is these residents are going to be pissed off. They're like, what? I have to pay you to upgrade your factory? That's not fair, right? It might be really hard to get all 1,000 people to pay, right? You're going to have to send someone around to collect money from every single person or something like that. That sounds like it might be really difficult. Right, they might feel entitled to the lake, right? And they're like, no, you have to pay. That would be kind of like the idea if the residents have the legal right to swim, right? And it depends. Like, there's a lot of stuff I'm not telling you. The residents might have a legal right to swim, in which case the factory would have to pay for its own equipment. But if the factory has the legal right to pollute, these people will have to pay, right? Either way, though, the Coase solution would be that people get to be able to swim in the lake. But there's so many problems. There's the coordination problem. You can't, get everybody together to pay. You have to send somebody to find everybody, track them down, make them pay for their amount, right? Okay, so let's see. Why might this not work in the real world? One, transaction costs. Let's say that both sides had to get lawyers and they were super expensive. Then it might be, the costs might go above the $100,000 benefit mark, right? And then you wouldn't have it. Stubbornness, right? People might feel entitled. People might be like, no, I want to hold out for a better deal. And then there's this coordination problem. You have to track everybody down in Green Lake or in Green Valley and get them to each pay $1,000. Right? Or I guess it would be $500. They'd each have to pay $500 to the factory.